The last hymn echoed through the empty pews of St. Matthew's Lutheran Church in Langdon, North Dakota, on a cold Sunday morning in March 2019. Pastor Rebecca Miller looked out at 12 congregants scattered across a sanctuary built for 300. The average age was 74. Within 6 months, the doors would close forever, ending 127 years of continuous worship in a building that once overflowed every Sunday with farmers, shopkeepers, and their families. St. Matthew's wasn't unique. That same year, over 4,500 churches across rural America shuttered their doors permanently. But this story isn't just about empty buildings or aging congregations. It's about the unraveling of something far more profound, the social fabric that held entire communities together for generations. In 1950, 91% of Americans identified as Christian. Small towns were the beating heart of American faith, where church bells marked time more reliably than clocks, where Wednesday night Bible study was as essential as Saturday's high school football game. Today, that number has plummeted to 63%, and in many rural counties, it's dropped below 50% for the first time in recorded history. What happened? How did communities that once defined themselves by their faith find themselves spiritually adrift? And perhaps more importantly, what fills the void when the cornerstone of community life crumbles away? The transformation didn't happen overnight. It began with a single devastating blow that most people never saw coming. The year was 1980, and American agriculture was in crisis. Interest rates soared above 20%. Farmland values collapsed by 40% in just 5 years. The farm crisis, as historians now call it, wasn't just an economic disaster. It was a spiritual earthquake that shook the foundation of rural faith. Consider the story of Hartley, Iowa, population 1,672 in 1980. The town boasted 6 thriving churches: Methodist, Lutheran, Catholic, Presbyterian, Baptist, and Assembly of God. The farmers who filled those pews on Sunday mornings were the same families whose names appeared on the town's Main Street businesses: the hardware store, the grain elevator, the cafe where everyone gathered for coffee and gossip. But when corn prices crashed from $3.50 per bushel to $1.50, those farmers didn't just lose their livelihoods, they lost their faith. Reverend Thomas Anderson of Hartley's First Methodist Church kept detailed records during those dark years. His pastoral notes reveal a pattern that would repeat across thousands of communities. Church attendance dropped by 30% between 1982 and 1987. Tithing fell by nearly half. More troubling, Anderson documented a crisis of faith itself. How can God let this happen to good, faithful people? Was the question Anderson heard most often during counseling sessions. For many farmers, working the land wasn't just a job. It was a calling, a partnership with the divine. When that partnership seemed broken, traditional answers felt hollow. The numbers tell the story starkly. In 1980, Iowa had 2,196 active churches. By 1990, that number had dropped to 2,094. But the real devastation was yet to come. The second wave of destruction arrived silently, carried in the hands of young people clutching college acceptance letters and dreams too big for their hometowns. Between 1950 and 2000, rural America lost 37% of its young adults to urban migration. But this wasn't just any demographic, it was the future of rural churches walking away. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a sociologist at Kansas State University who spent 20 years documenting rural church decline, discovered something unexpected in her research. We assume the young people left because they lost faith, she explains, but our interviews revealed the opposite. Many left because of their faith. They wanted to use their education to serve God in ways their small towns couldn't offer. Medical missions, urban ministry, international development work. The irony was crushing. The very values that rural churches instilled in their young people, service, education, making a difference in the world, were the same values that pulled them away from rural communities. Take Jennifer Walsh, raised in the tiny farming community of Nelson, Nebraska. The daughter of Methodist farmers, she felt called to ministry during her senior year of high school. But the nearest seminary was 400 miles away in Denver. After completing her studies, she was assigned to an urban congregation in Chicago, where she could reach more souls and make a greater impact than returning to Nelson's 35-member church. I never intended to abandon my home, Walsh reflects now, serving a congregation of Minan 200 in suburban Chicago. But there simply wasn't room for my calling in a town of 500 people. Multiply Jennifer's story by thousands, and you begin to understand why rural churches found themselves hemorrhaging not just members, but potential leaders. The educated, faithful young adults who might have revitalized aging congregations were scattered across cities hundreds of miles away. But economic hardship and youth migration, devastating as they were, weren't the final blows. The killing stroke came from an unexpected direction. The very technology that promised to connect communities was quietly tearing them apart. Pastor David Chen arrived in Millerville, Minnesota in 1998, full of hope and digital age enthusiasm. The town's population had dwindled to 847, but Chen believed technology could reverse the decline. He installed high-speed internet in the church, created a website, and started streaming services online. He was one of the first rural pastors to embrace social media, creating Facebook groups and YouTube videos to reach beyond the physical boundaries of his small congregation. What Chen discovered changed everything he thought he knew about faith and community. The internet gave my parishioners access to celebrity pastors from around the world, Chen recalls. Why listen to my sermon about forgiveness when you could watch Joel Osteen or Joyce Meyer deliver a more polished message to millions? Why participate in our small choir when you could worship along with Hillsong United's professional recordings? The data supports Chen's observation. A 2019 study by the Barna Group found that rural Christians were 30% more likely than urban Christians to consume religious content online rather than attend in-person services. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. Online religious engagement didn't supplement local church attendance. It replaced it. The psychological explanation is surprisingly simple. Humans have a limited capacity for religious community. When that need is met virtually, the motivation to engage physically diminishes. Rural churches, already struggling with small congregations and limited resources, couldn't compete with the production values and celebrity appeal of online ministries. Chen watched his Sunday attendance drop from 62 to 31 over 5 years, even as his online following grew to over 2,000 people worldwide. I was reaching more souls than ever before, he says, but I was losing my actual community. The megachurch phenomenon delivered another devastating blow to rural faith communities. Between 1990 and 2020, the number of churches with over 2,000 weekly attendees grew from 310 to 1,750. But these spiritual superstores weren't distributed evenly. They clustered around cities and suburbs, creating a gravitational pull that drew believers from hundreds of miles away. Consider what happened in central Kansas. Wichita, with a metropolitan population of 650,000, became home to 12 megachurches by 2015. Families from small towns within a 90-minute drive found themselves facing a choice. Attend their local church with 30 members, a part-time pastor, and a struggling budget, or drive to Wichita for professional quality worship, comprehensive youth programs, and a sense of being part of something larger and more dynamic. The Hendricks family from Lindsborg, Kansas, made that choice in 2008. For 3 generations, they had attended Bethany Lutheran Church in their town of 3,300 people. But when their teenage daughter expressed interest in a youth program, Bethany Lutheran could offer a group of 4 teenagers and a volunteer leader. 90 minutes away, New Spring Church in Wichita offered a youth ministry with 400 participants, professional staff, and a budget larger than Bethany Lutheran's entire annual income. It wasn't a crisis of faith, explains Robert Hendricks. It was about giving our daughter the best spiritual foundation possible. We still loved our home church, but we loved our daughter more. The Hendricks drove to Wichita every Sunday for 6 years until they eventually moved there entirely when Robert found a better job. Their story repeated thousands of times across rural America, creating a feedback loop. As rural churches lost members to megachurches, they became even less capable of competing, which drove more members away. By 2010, the perfect storm had devastated rural faith communities across America. But the most surprising discovery came from researchers who studied what happened next. In the absence of traditional religious community, something unexpected began to flourish. Dr. Amanda Rodriguez, an anthropologist at the University of Nebraska, spent 5 years living in small towns that had lost their churches, documenting what she calls post-institutional spirituality. Her findings challenge everything we thought we knew about faith in America. People didn't stop believing, Rodriguez explains. They stopped belonging to organized religion. But nature abhors a vacuum, and human beings need spiritual community. So they created new forms. In Elcotter, Iowa, after the Methodist Church closed in 2014, a group of former congregants began meeting monthly in each other's homes for what they called kitchen table faith. No ordained pastor, no formal liturgy, just neighbors sharing meals, discussing life's challenges, and supporting each other through difficult times. Within 3 years, their informal gatherings had grown to include 70% of the town's adults. We realized we didn't need a building or a pastor to have faith, explains Martha Stevens, one of Kitchen Table Faith's founding members. We just needed each other. Similar movements emerged across rural America. In Montana, cowboy churches met in barns and held services that looked more like community gatherings than traditional worship. In Vermont, forest spirituality groups combined hiking with meditation and ecological stewardship. In Texas, Cafe Faith transformed local diners into weekly spiritual communities. These new forms of spiritual community shared common characteristics. They were less hierarchical, more inclusive, more focused on practical service than theological doctrine, and deeply rooted in local culture rather than denominational traditions. But the story takes another unexpected turn when we examine what these new spiritual communities actually accomplished. Researchers tracking social cohesion in rural areas made a startling discovery. Towns that developed strong post-institutional spiritual communities showed higher levels of civic engagement, lower crime rates, and greater economic resilience than towns that simply lost their churches without replacement. Consider the tale of two towns in western Kansas, separated by just 30 miles. Grainfield, population 278, lost its last church in 2017 and never developed alternative spiritual community. Social isolation increased, volunteerism declined, and the town council struggled to find candidates for local offices. Crime, while still low by urban standards, increased by 40% over 3 years. Meanwhile, Quinter, population 918, lost 2 of its 3 churches between 2015 and 2018. But residents organized Common Ground, a weekly gathering that combined elements of traditional worship with community problem-solving sessions. They met in the school gymnasium and rotated leadership among community members. By 2020, Quinter had the highest voter turnout in their county, launched a successful downtown revitalization project, and attracted 3 new businesses to their main street. The difference wasn't faith versus no faith, it was organized community versus isolation. Dr. Robert Putnam, Harvard sociologist and author of Bowling Alone, has tracked this phenomenon for decades. Religious institutions weren't just about faith, he explains. They were America's largest source of social capital, the connections between people that make communities function. When churches close without replacement, communities lose their primary mechanism for collective action. But here's where our story reveals its most intriguing plot twist. The decline of traditional rural churches may have inadvertently sparked the greatest innovation in American spiritual community since the Great Awakening of the 1740s. Welcome to Professor Archive, where we uncover the hidden stories that shaped our world. I'm your host, and if you're enjoying this deep dive into America's spiritual transformation, I'd love to know, where are you watching from, and what time is it there? Are you in one of these small towns we're discussing, or are you watching from a bustling city? Drop a comment and let me know your profession too. I'm always curious about the diverse community we've built here. The innovation came from an unlikely source. Former pastors who found themselves without congregations but still felt called to ministry. Rather than accept defeat, many began experimenting with entirely new models of spiritual leadership. Reverend Michael Torres exemplifies this transformation. After his church in rural Montana closed in 2019, Torres didn't seek another pastoral position. Instead, he became what he calls a circuit minister, serving 6 different communities within a 150-mile radius. But instead of holding traditional services, Torres facilitates what he calls sacred conversations in community centers, libraries, and even gas stations. I realized that people were hungry for spiritual discussion, but they weren't hungry for institutional religion, Torres explains. So I started meeting people where they were, literally and figuratively. Torres's model has been replicated across rural America. These new circuit ministers don't represent specific denominations. Instead, they serve as spiritual facilitators, helping communities explore questions of meaning, purpose, and connection without the constraints of traditional theological doctrine. The results have been remarkable. Communities served by circuit ministers report higher levels of social cohesion than those served by traditional churches, according to a 2021 study by the Rural Church Research Institute. More surprisingly, these communities also show greater religious tolerance and interfaith cooperation. When you remove denominational barriers, and explains Dr. Lisa Chen, lead researcher on the study, people discover they have more in common spiritually than they thought. A Methodist farmer and a Catholic teacher can explore questions of faith together without worrying about doctrinal differences. But perhaps the most significant development in post-church rural America has been the emergence of what sociologists call practical spirituality. Faith communities organized around addressing concrete community needs rather than abstract theological concerns. In Hugoton, Kansas, after the town's largest church closed in 2020, a group of former congregants organized Neighbors Helping Neighbors. They meet every Sunday morning, but instead of traditional worship, they coordinate community service projects, delivering groceries to elderly residents, maintaining the town park, organizing blood drives, and providing disaster relief. We asked ourselves, what would Jesus actually do in Hugoton today? Explains coordinator Maria Santos. The answer wasn't sitting in pews singing hymns. It was taking care of each other and our community. Neighbors Helping. Neighbors has accomplished more tangible good in 3 years than the previous church managed in a decade. They've built wheelchair ramps for 12 homes, established a food pantry that serves the entire county, and created a childcare cooperative that allows single parents to work. We discovered that faith without works is dead, but works without institutional bureaucracy is incredibly alive, Santos reflects. This model has spread across rural America like wildfire. Action-based faith communities now operate in over 3,000 small towns, according to the National Rural Ministry Association. They're characterized by practical service, inclusive membership, and measurable community impact. The theological implications are profound. These communities have essentially returned to the earliest Christian model. Small groups of believers focused on serving their neighbors rather than maintaining institutional structures. The economic dimension of this transformation reveals another layer of complexity. Rural churches weren't just spiritual centers, they were significant economic engines. A mid-sized rural church with 150 members typically generated $200,000 in annual economic activity through salaries, building maintenance, and community events. When churches close, that economic activity vanishes. But the new spiritual communities have found innovative ways to fill this gap. Many action-based faith communities have become social enterprises, launching businesses that serve both spiritual and economic purposes. In Brewster, Nebraska, the Common Purpose community opened a cafe that serves as both a meeting place and a source of revenue for community projects. In Sublette, Kansas, a group of former church members launched a farm-to-table cooperative that connects local producers with urban markets while providing a venue for spiritual fellowship. We realized that separating faith from economics was artificial, explains Tom Bradley, co-founder of the Sublette Cooperative. In the Bible, the early church shared everything in common. We're just adapting that model to the 21st century. These spiritual social enterprises are reshaping rural economies in unexpected ways. They're more flexible than traditional churches, more mission-driven than typical businesses, and more economically sustainable than either alone. The generational divide in rural spiritual communities tells perhaps the most fascinating part of this story. Researchers expected to find that older residents clung to traditional church models while younger people drove innovation. The reality proved far more complex. Dr. Jennifer Park, who studied generational differences in rural spirituality for the University of Iowa, discovered that age was less predictive of spiritual adaptation than life experience. The people most likely to embrace new forms of spiritual community weren't the youngest or oldest residents, Park explains. They were people who had experienced significant life disruption, job loss, divorce, health crises, or military service. This finding explains why some 80-year-old farmers became enthusiastic participants in experimental spiritual communities, while some 30-year-old residents remained nostalgic for traditional church services they never actually attended regularly. The implications for rural America's future are profound. As climate change, economic disruption, and technological transformation accelerate, rural communities will face increasing challenges that require adaptive spiritual resilience. The communities that have already learned to innovate spiritually are better positioned to handle future disruptions. But what about the children? This question haunts every discussion of rural spiritual transformation. Traditional churches provided crucial services for young families: Sunday school, youth groups, vacation Bible school, and rites of passage like confirmation and First Communion. How do post-institutional spiritual communities serve the next generation? The answer has surprised researchers and participants alike. Many new spiritual communities have become more, not less, focused on children and families. Without the constraints of traditional religious education curricula, they've developed innovative approaches to spiritual formation. In Aurora, Nebraska, the Growing Together community combines outdoor education with spiritual exploration. Children learn about ecology, sustainability, and stewardship while exploring questions of meaning and purpose. We're raising kids who understand that caring for creation is a spiritual practice, explains facilitator Rachel Johnson. These programs often attract families who wouldn't have been comfortable in traditional church settings. Interfaith families, single parents, and families with LGBTQ+ members. The inclusivity has actually expanded rather than contracted the spiritual community. My daughter is growing up with a deeper spiritual foundation than I had, reflects parent Michael Chen. She's learning that faith is about how you treat people and how you care for the world, not about following rules or believing specific doctrines. Early indicators suggest these children are developing strong moral compasses and community connections. Long-term studies are still underway, but preliminary data shows they volunteer more, show greater environmental awareness, and report higher levels of life satisfaction than their peers in traditional religious settings. The transformation of rural spirituality has also revealed unexpected connections to broader American religious trends. While rural churches were closing, urban and suburban megachurches were facing their own crisis of authenticity. Many city dwellers, overwhelmed by the scale and impersonality of large congregations, began seeking the intimacy and community focus that characterized rural spiritual innovation. This created an unlikely bridge between rural and urban America. House church movements in cities began adopting models pioneered by rural communities. Urban professionals started driving to small towns for authentic spiritual experiences. Some rural communities began hosting spiritual retreats that attracted visitors from hundreds of miles away. Sarah Mitchell, a marketing executive from Chicago, has made monthly trips to kitchen table faith gatherings in Elkader, Iowa for 3 years. There's something about spiritual community in a small town that you can't replicate in the city, she explains. The relationships are real, the service is immediate, and the impact is visible. This rural-urban spiritual exchange has benefited both communities. Rural areas gain economic support from spiritual tourism, while urban visitors bring fresh perspectives and resources to rural spiritual communities. The role of women in rural spiritual transformation deserves special attention. Traditional rural churches were often more conservative about women's leadership roles than their urban counterparts. But the collapse of institutional structures created opportunities for women to lead in unprecedented ways. A 2022 study found that women lead 67% of new spiritual communities in rural areas, compared to just 31% of traditional rural churches. This shift has had profound implications for both spiritual practice and community leadership. When women lead spiritual communities, the focus shifts from authority to collaboration, from doctrine to care, from hierarchy to circle. Observes Dr. Maria Santos, who studies gender and rural religion at Texas A&M University. It's not that one approach is better than the other, but the different approach serves struggling communities differently. Women-led spiritual communities are more likely to address practical needs like childcare, elder care, and mental health support. They're also more likely to partner with secular organizations and government agencies to address community challenges. Pastor Linda Williams, who leads a Faithful Action community in rural Wyoming, exemplifies this approach. "We don't wait for people to come to us," she explains. "We go where the need is, the senior center, the food bank, the school. Faith is a verb, not a noun." The COVID-19 pandemic provided an unexpected test case for rural spiritual innovation. While traditional churches struggled to adapt to digital formats and social distancing requirements, many new spiritual communities found themselves uniquely prepared for crisis response. The common ground. Community in Quinter, Kansas, which we encountered earlier, mobilized within 48 hours of the first COVID lockdown orders. They organized grocery delivery for elderly residents, created childcare pods for essential workers, and established a mental health support network, all before government assistance programs were even announced. We realized that our weekly gatherings had taught us to respond to community needs quickly and collaboratively, explains coordinator David Park. When the pandemic hit, we already had the relationships and structures needed to help each other. Traditional churches, constrained by denominational protocols and insurance requirements, often took weeks to organize similar responses. The contrast highlighted how institutional structures that provide stability in normal times can become obstacles during crises. The pandemic also accelerated the adoption of hybrid models that combine physical and digital engagement. Many rural spiritual communities discovered they could maintain local community while connecting with broader networks of similar communities across the country. As we look toward the future, several clear trends emerge from the transformation of rural American spirituality. First, the era of denominational dominance in rural areas appears to be ending permanently. While some traditional churches will survive and even thrive, they'll do so alongside a diverse ecosystem of spiritual communities that would have been unimaginable 50 years ago. Second, the separation between sacred and secular that characterized 20th century American religion is dissolving in rural areas. New spiritual communities seamlessly integrate worship, service, economic development, and civic engagement in ways that traditional institutional structures couldn't accommodate. Third, rural spiritual innovation is influencing urban and suburban religious practice. The house church movement, social enterprise ministries, and action-based faith communities pioneered in rural areas are being adapted for city contexts. Fourth, the democratization of spiritual leadership is fundamentally changing who has religious authority in America. The new rural spiritual leaders are farmers, teachers, social workers, and retirees. People with deep community roots rather than seminary degrees. But perhaps the most significant development is the emergence of what researchers call indigenous spirituality. Faith practices rooted in specific places, communities, and challenges rather than universal doctrines or institutional traditions. In the Dakotas, former church members have begun incorporating Native American spiritual practices into their gatherings, recognizing the connection between land stewardship and spiritual health. In Appalachia, spiritual communities focus on environmental justice and economic equality as core faith practices. In the Southwest, water conservation and immigration support define spiritual mission. These communities are developing theology from the ground up, explains Dr. Native spirituality researcher Dr. Jennifer Crow Feather. Instead of applying universal religious principles to local situations, They're discovering spiritual truth through engagement with their specific place and people. This localized approach to spirituality represents a fundamental shift away from the standardization that characterized American religion for most of the 20th century. It's creating a rich diversity of spiritual expression that reflects the actual diversity of American communities. The economic implications of this spiritual transformation extend far beyond rural communities. As climate change and technological disruption reshape the American economy, the adaptive resilience demonstrated by post-institutional spiritual communities offers a model for broader social innovation. These communities have learned to create social cohesion and economic opportunity without large institutional overhead, notes economist Dr. Sarah Mitchell. That's exactly the kind of innovation we need as traditional employment and social structures become less reliable. Some forward-thinking corporations have begun partnering with rural spiritual communities for employee wellness programs, supply chain sustainability, and community development initiatives. The collaborative leadership skills and practical problem-solving focus of these communities translates surprisingly well to business contexts. The mental health dimension of rural spiritual transformation reveals another crucial aspect of this story. Rural areas have historically faced significant challenges with mental health services, limited access to professional counselors, stigma around seeking help, and economic barriers to treatment. Traditional rural churches provided some mental health support through pastoral counseling, but many pastors lacked training for serious mental health issues. The new spiritual communities have developed innovative approaches that combine peer support, practical assistance, and spiritual care. The Healing Circles model, pioneered in rural Montana and now operating in over 200 communities, trains community members in basic counseling skills and creates support networks for people dealing with depression, anxiety, addiction, and trauma. These circles don't replace professional mental health care, but they provide immediate, accessible support that often prevents crises. We're not trying to be therapists, explains Healing Circles facilitator Robert Torres. We're trying to be community. Sometimes that's more healing than therapy. Studies show that rural residents participating in these spiritual support networks have lower rates of suicide, substance abuse, and domestic violence than comparable communities without such programs. The environmental dimension of rural spiritual transformation has surprised many observers. Traditional rural churches often focused on personal salvation and family values, with limited attention to ecological concerns. But many new spiritual communities have made environmental stewardship central to their mission. This shift reflects both practical necessity and theological evolution. Rural communities face direct impacts from climate change, drought, flooding, extreme weather events that make environmental issues impossible to ignore. At the same time, working closely with the land has led many rural spiritual communities to develop what theologians call creation spirituality. The sacred agriculture movement, active in over 500 rural communities, combines sustainable farming practices with spiritual formation. Participants see caring for soil, water, and wildlife as acts of worship. They've developed farming techniques that are both economically viable and environmentally regenerative. When you really understand that the earth is God's creation, you can't justify destroying it for short-term profit, explains Sacred Agriculture Coordinator Maria Santos. Our faith demands that we be good stewards. These communities are becoming laboratories for sustainable rural development, developing models that balance economic necessity with environmental responsibility. The political implications of rural spiritual transformation are complex and often surprising. Traditional rural churches were increasingly aligned with conservative political movements, particularly on social issues. But many new spiritual communities resist easy political categorization. They tend to be economically populist, supporting policies that help working families and small communities while being socially inclusive. They're skeptical of both big government and big business, preferring local solutions to local problems. They're patriotic but critical of military interventionism. They value traditional family structures while welcoming non-traditional families. We don't fit into the red state, blue state narrative, explains Common Ground coordinator Linda Williams. We're purple communities. conservative in some ways, progressive in others, but always focused on what works for real people. This political complexity has made rural spiritual communities important but unpredictable voices in American political discourse. They're courted by both parties but fully captured by neither. As our story nears its conclusion, one question remains. Is this transformation ultimately positive or negative for American society? The answer depends partly on your perspective, but the evidence suggests a mixed legacy with ultimately hopeful implications. The loss of traditional rural churches represents a genuine cultural loss. These institutions preserved traditions, provided stability, and connected rural communities to broader religious movements that date back centuries. Their disappearance leaves rural America less connected to its historical roots and potentially more vulnerable to social fragmentation. But the emergence of innovative spiritual communities demonstrates remarkable resilience and creativity. Rural Americans didn't simply surrender to decline, they adapted, innovated, and created new forms of spiritual community that may be better suited to 21st century challenges. Dr. Robert Putnam, reflecting on 40 years of studying American community life, offers this assessment. The rural church decline was a crisis, but the response to that crisis may produce stronger, more inclusive, more adaptable spiritual communities than what was lost. The transformation isn't complete. Many rural communities are still struggling to develop sustainable spiritual community after church closure. But the models pioneered by successful communities are spreading rapidly, creating a network of innovation that spans rural America. The story of how small towns lost their faith, and what comes next, is ultimately a story about American adaptability. When economic, demographic, and technological changes destroyed traditional institutions, rural Americans didn't abandon their spiritual needs. They found new ways to meet those needs that were often more inclusive, more practical, and more directly connected to their daily lives. These new spiritual communities aren't perfect. They lack the historical depth and institutional resources of traditional churches. They're more vulnerable to personality conflicts and local politics. They struggle to serve communities scattered across large geographic areas. But they offer something that many traditional churches had lost: authentic community connection, practical service, and spiritual exploration that speaks to contemporary challenges. They've proven that faith can survive and even thrive without institutional structures. That community can be built around shared values rather than shared doctrine, and that spiritual leadership can emerge from unexpected places. As climate change, economic disruption, and social transformation accelerate, the adaptive strategies pioneered by rural spiritual communities may prove essential for all of American society. They've learned to create resilience without resources, community without institutions, and hope without guarantees. The bells may have fallen silent in thousands of rural churches, but the spirit that built those communities lives on in new forms. Whether gathering around kitchen tables, meeting in community centers, or working together in community gardens, rural Americans continue to seek meaning, purpose, and connection. They're writing the next chapter of American spirituality, one small community at a time. The question isn't whether faith has a future in rural America, it's what that future will look like. If the past decade is any indication, it will be more diverse, more adaptive, and more directly engaged with the challenges of contemporary life than anyone predicted. The small towns didn't lose their faith, they transformed it. And that's where we'll leave our story today. If this deep dive into America's spiritual transformation resonated with you, consider leaving a super thanks to help support Professor Archive's research and production. These stories take months to research and weeks to craft, and your support makes it possible to bring you the hidden histories that shaped our world. What do you think about this transformation? Are we witnessing the death of rural faith or its rebirth in new forms? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from Professor Archive. Until next time, keep questioning what you think you know about history. The most fascinating truths are often hiding in plain sight.